My mother stood at my wedding reception with a champagne flute in one hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, tapping a spoon against the crystal until the music lowered and 200 guests turned to face her. And I remember thinking for one stupid, hopeful moment that she was finally going to say something kind, something that acknowledged this day was about me and David, something that might feel like the maternal warmth I'd spent 28 years craving. But instead, she said, I just wanted to share some family news while we're all together. We've decided to pass along the car that David's parents gave Sarah and David to her brother Jake, since he really needs it more right now as he's starting his job search, and these two already have such good salaries. And I felt my smile freeze on my face like a mask made of ice. That car was worth $28,000. David's parents had presented us with the keys 6 months earlier at our engagement party, a generous gift meant to help us start our married life, and my mother had just announced to everyone we knew that she was giving it away to my 25-year-old brother as casually as if she were passing along a used book. I'm Sarah Chen, and that moment at my wedding reception was when something inside me finally, irrevocably broke. But to understand why, you have to understand the 28 years that led up to it. I grew up in Naperville, Illinois, in a house where love always felt conditional and praise was rationed like water in a drought, at least for me. My brother Jake arrived when I was 3 years old, and from what I can piece together from family stories and photo albums, that was when I stopped being the center of my parents' universe and became something more like a supporting character in Jake's story. My mother likes to tell people that Jake was an easy baby while I was colicky and difficult, as if our worth was determined in those first months and nothing that came after could change the calculation. I learned early to be good, to be quiet, to excel in ways that didn't demand too much attention, because attention in my family was a finite resource, and Jake had a permanent claim on most of it. When I brought home straight A's in 5th grade, my mother glanced at my report card and said, "That's nice, honey," before turning back to help Jake with his math homework, the same math concepts I'd mastered 2 years earlier without anyone's help. When I scored in the 98th percentile on my PSATs, my father said, "Don't let it go to your head," as if confidence was something dangerous that needed to be kept in check. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their validation, that I was fine on my own, and in some ways I learned to be incredibly self-sufficient, but there was always this hollow space inside me where their pride should have been. High school brought the pattern into sharper focus, like adjusting binoculars until the distant landscape becomes painfully clear. I was junior class president, editor of the school newspaper, captain of the debate team, and I maintained a 4.0 GPA while working 15 hours a week at the local library. To save for college expenses, my parents had made clear they expected me to help cover. Jake played junior varsity basketball and got mostly B's and C's, and when report cards came out, my parents took him to his favorite steakhouse to celebrate his improvement in English. He'd gone from a D to a C minus, while my straight A's earned a nod and, "We expect that from you, Sarah." I remember standing in the kitchen holding my report card, feeling the paper crumple slightly in my grip, wondering what I would have to do to deserve a celebratory dinner, wondering if there was any achievement high enough to warrant the pride I saw them shower on Jake for the bare minimum. When college acceptance letters arrived in the spring of my senior year, I got into Northwestern University with a full academic scholarship that covered tuition, room, and board. $53,000 a year, all of it earned through my own work. And my mother's response was, "That's good, honey, but it's so far from home. Are you sure you want to be in Chicago?" As if my full-ride scholarship to a top 20 university was somehow a questionable decision. Jake was still a sophomore in high school then, but my father was already talking about which state schools might be a good fit for him, already promising they'd help him out financially when the time came, and I felt something hard and bitter forming in my chest, like a stone I was learning to carry. Northwestern was transformative for me. in ways that had nothing to do with the excellent education or the degree that would later open doors into competitive marketing positions. It was the first time I was surrounded by people who valued achievement, who celebrated each other's successes without resentment or dismissal, who made me realize that the way I'd grown up wasn't normal or acceptable. My roommate freshman year was Amanda Chen, no relation, though we joked about being long-lost cousins. And when I mentioned casually that my parents hadn't come to Parents' Weekend because they were attending Jake's high school football game, she looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language. Wait, they chose a regular season high school game over your parents' weekend at Northwestern? She asked. And I shrugged, because it hadn't even occurred to me to be hurt by it. I'd simply accepted it as the natural order of things. Amanda's parents drove 6 hours from Michigan that weekend and took both of us out to dinner, and her mother spent the evening asking me about my classes and my goals with genuine interest that made my throat tight with emotions I couldn't name. I graduated summa cum laude in 3.5 years, saving a semester's worth of living expenses, and landed a marketing coordinator position at a respected Chicago firm 3 weeks after graduation. My parents came to graduation but left immediately after the ceremony to get back for Jake's basketball banquet that evening. They never saw my apartment in Lincoln Park, never asked about my job, never seemed to register that I was building a life and career in a city that was starting to feel more like home than Naperville ever had. When I was promoted to marketing manager 2 years later at age 24 with a salary of $68,000, I called to tell them, and my father said, "That's nice," and then spent 10 minutes telling me about Jake making the intramural softball team at the community college he was attending after barely graduating high school. I met David Rothstein when I was 26 at a marketing conference in downtown Chicago, and he was the first person I'd dated who seemed to understand that quiet, driven part of me that had learned to achieve without expecting applause, the first person who celebrated my successes without reservation or the subtle undertone of resentment I'd grown accustomed to from my family. David was a financial analyst at Morgan Stanley, 29 years old, brilliant with numbers and kind in ways that still surprised me even after months of dating. And when he took me home to meet his parents in their comfortable home in Evanston, 6 months into our relationship, I felt like I'd stepped into an alternate universe where parents actually asked their children about their lives and listened to the answers with genuine interest. David's mother Ellen had hugged me at the door like I was already family, and his father Richard had spent an hour asking thoughtful questions about my work and marketing strategy. And when I mentioned my recent promotion to marketing director, Ellen had literally clasped her hands together and said, "That's wonderful, Sarah. You must have worked so hard for that." And I'd had to excuse myself to the bathroom because unexpected kindness had become something that made me cry. We got engaged on a Saturday evening in October, after 2 years of dating, just the two of us at the lakefront with the Chicago skyline lit up behind us. And when we drove to Evanston the next day to tell his parents, they opened a bottle of champagne they'd been saving, and Ellen cried happy tears, and Richard shook David's hand and then pulled me into a hug and said, "Welcome to the family officially." David's parents hosted an engagement party 3 weeks later at their home, inviting close friends and family, and that was when they presented us with the car keys. A 2-year-old Honda Accord in deep blue, reliable and beautiful, worth $28,000 according to the paperwork Richard handed us, along with the title already transferred into both our names. "We wanted to help you two start your life together," Ellen had said, her hand on my arm, warm and steady. "And we know how expensive the city can be, so please, let this be one less thing you have to worry about." I'd called my parents that evening to share the news about the engagement party and the incredibly generous gift, and my mother's response had been, "Well, that's very nice of them, but isn't it a bit much? You two have good jobs, why do you need them to buy you a car?" As if accepting generosity was somehow shameful, as if David's parents' kindness was something suspect rather than the genuine love it so clearly was. When David and I started planning the wedding 6 months before our chosen date in June, Sitting down with my parents to discuss their contribution and involvement, they offered $5,000 toward the wedding with an air of magnanimity that suggested they considered it generous, while David's parents had privately told us they wanted to contribute $30,000 and insisted we spend it on making the day exactly what we wanted. My mother had opinions about everything. The venue was too expensive, the guest list too large, the flowers too extravagant. My choice of a fitted wedding dress, not flattering for your figure, honey, maybe something with more coverage? But she didn't offer to help with planning or shopping or any of the thousand decisions that go into creating a wedding. She simply criticized from a distance. 3 months before the wedding, my parents announced at a family dinner that Jake would be one of the groomsmen, which would have been fine except they said it like it was already decided, like they'd told Jake before asking David, and when David gently pointed out that he'd actually already chosen his groomsmen, including his brother and close friends, my father had frowned and said, "Well, Jake's going to be your brother-in-law. He should be included," as if family obligation trumped David's right to choose his own wedding party. The breaking point of that particular evening came when my mother asked, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp, "So what are you two going to do with that car David's parents gave you? Seems like a lot of car for city driving. You might want to think about selling it and getting something more practical." And I'd felt David's hand find mine under the table, squeezing gently, grounding me before I could say something I might regret. 3 months before the wedding, my mother called on a Tuesday afternoon to tell me she wouldn't be able to make it to my final dress fitting scheduled for that Saturday because Jake had a recreational softball game an hour away, and she and my father wanted to be there to support him. And when I pointed out that I'd scheduled this fitting 6 weeks ago and had reminded her twice, she said, "Honey, you'll have other chances to try on the dress, but Jake's games are only on weekends, and it means so much to him when we're there," as if my wedding dress fitting was somehow less important than watching my 25-year-old brother play amateur softball. The appointment was at a bridal boutique in downtown Chicago, and I'd specifically chosen a Saturday, hoping my mother could actually attend. And when I showed up alone and the consultant asked with such gentle sympathy where my mother was, I lied and said she was feeling unwell because admitting the truth felt like exposing something shameful about myself rather than about her. That same week, I was going through old financial records while organizing documents for the marriage license, and I came across the bank statements from 2 years earlier that showed the $3,000 transfer I'd made to my parents when my father had called saying they were short on the mortgage payment, and could I help them out just this once, promising they'd pay me back within 3 months. 3 months had come and gone, then 6 months, then a year, and whenever I gently mentioned it, my mother had said, "We're still catching up from that rough patch, honey, you understand. We'll get it to you when we can." And I'd stopped asking because I felt greedy and small for wanting my own money back from my parents who had raised me and fed me and kept a roof over my head for 18 years. But 2 weeks after I'd stopped asking about the loan, Jake had posted photos on social media of his new gaming computer setup, a top-of-the-line system with multiple monitors and specialized equipment that I knew from David's gaming hobby cost at least $2,500. And when I'd asked my mother about it at Sunday dinner, she'd said brightly, "Oh, we wanted to get Jake something nice since he's been working so hard at his new job." The job being a part-time position at Best Buy where he worked 20 hours a week and still lived at home rent-free at age 25. And the dress-fitting incident and the loan memory were still fresh in my mind when I got promoted to senior marketing director 3 weeks before that conversation, a major advancement that came with a significant raise to $95,000 annually and leadership over a team of 12 people, and I'd called my parents that evening with the news, my voice probably betraying more excitement than I usually allowed myself to show. My father had answered, and I'd told him about the promotion, about the new responsibilities, and the validation of my work over the past 4 years. And there was a pause before he said, "That's good, Sarah. But when are you going to settle down and focus on family? You're getting married in 3 months. Don't you think it's time to think about what really matters?" I'd stood in my apartment kitchen with my phone pressed to my ear, looking out at the Chicago skyline as the sun set, and I'd realized with a clarity that felt like ice water that my father didn't mean. When was I going to focus on David and our marriage? He meant when was I going to quit my job and become someone whose entire identity revolved around supporting a husband and raising children? When was I going to stop achieving things that made him uncomfortable? 2 months before the wedding, when David and I sat down to finalize the rehearsal dinner plans, I called my mother to confirm the guest list we'd discussed, and she mentioned casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, that Jake's new girlfriend Melissa would be coming, and did we need her address for the invitation? And when I paused, confused, and said we hadn't planned to include Jake's girlfriend of 3 weeks at the rehearsal dinner since it was supposed to be immediate family and wedding party only, my mother's voice took on that edge of irritation I knew so well, and she said, "Don't be ridiculous, Sarah. Jake wants her there and she's practically family now. You're not going to exclude her, are you?" And I had bitten back the response that she'd been dating David for 4 months before my parents had bothered to meet him. The rehearsal dinner venue I'd chosen was a private room at Avec, a restaurant in the West Loop that David and I loved, intimate and warm with excellent food, seating for 30 people maximum. And when I'd shared the details with my mother the week before, she'd frowned at the menu I'd shown her and said, "This seems very fancy, Sarah. Are you sure you need something this expensive for just a dinner? And some of these dishes, I don't even know what they are. What if people don't like the food?" Even though she'd contributed nothing to the cost and wouldn't have attended at all if she weren't the mother of the bride. My mother had opinions about the ceremony flowers too, calling them a bit much when I showed her photos of the romantic garden-style arrangements I'd chosen with the florist, white roses and peonies with trailing greenery, and she'd suggested something simpler, maybe carnations. They last longer and they're more practical. And I'd realized she was actually suggesting I choose cheaper, less beautiful flowers for my own wedding, because she considered my aesthetic preferences too extravagant. It was my cousin Jennifer who told me, 3 weeks into April, that my mother had been telling extended family members that I was high maintenance about the wedding, that I'd chosen expensive venues and was making a big fuss when I should just be grateful to be getting married, and Jennifer had called me specifically to say, "I just thought you should know what she's saying, because it's not fair and it's not true, and I wanted you to hear it from someone who actually cares about you." I'd sat on my couch after that phone call, feeling something crystallize inside me that had been forming for months, maybe years. The understanding that my mother would never celebrate me the way she celebrated Jake, would never be proud of my achievements or happy about my happiness, and that her criticism and dismissal wasn't about my actual choices or behavior, but about something fundamental in how she saw me, something I couldn't fix because it wasn't actually broken. David's parents had invited us to dinner at their home the following weekend, and over Ellen's homemade lasagna in their warm kitchen, Richard had asked gently how wedding planning was going and if my parents were being supportive, and something about the genuine concern in his voice had broken through my usual careful composure, and I'd found myself telling them everything, the missed dress fitting, and the dismissal of my promotion, and the way my mother criticized every choice I made while contributing nothing helpful. Ellen had reached across the table and taken my hand, her eyes bright with protective anger, and she'd said, "Sarah, honey, you know that none of this is normal or acceptable, right? You know that parents are supposed to support their children and celebrate their happiness, and what they're doing is not love. It's something else entirely." And Richard had added quietly, "We want you to know that you have us now, that you're our daughter too, in every way that matters, and we will always be in your corner." I started seeing Dr. Patricia Chen, a therapist in Lincoln Park, 2 weeks later at the recommendation of my best friend Rachel, who'd been gently suggesting therapy for the past year. And in our second session, when I was describing the pattern of my parents' treatment, Dr. Chen had suggested I start documenting specific incidents with dates and details. Not for any particular purpose, but because sometimes seeing patterns written down helped clarify what our minds tried to excuse or minimize, and I'd gone home that evening and bought a simple journal and started writing. April 15th. Mother missed dress fitting for Jake's softball game. April 22nd. Mother told family, I'm high maintenance. And the list had grown longer each week as I finally let myself see clearly what I'd been conditioned to accept. The week of the wedding, my parents were supposed to arrive in Chicago on Wednesday evening, 3 days before the Saturday ceremony, and I'd made reservations for them at the Hyatt Regency, where we'd secured a room block for out-of-town guests at a discounted rate of $149 per night. But when Wednesday came and went without hearing from them, I called my mother at 9 o'clock that night, and she answered saying breezily that they'd decided to stay at a Holiday Inn Express near the airport instead because it was cheaper and they'd just drive in for the events, as if the whole point of arriving early wasn't to spend time together before the wedding and help with last-minute preparations. They showed up Thursday afternoon, 2 hours late for the scheduled lunch with David's parents at Gibson's Steakhouse, and my mother walked in complaining about Chicago traffic as if she hadn't grown up in the suburbs and driven in the city 1,000 times, and when Ellen kindly suggested they might have avoided rush hour if they'd stayed at the downtown hotel, my mother had waved a dismissive hand and said, "We're not made of money like some people. We have to be practical." The comment landing with deliberate weight at a table where David's parents had just contributed $30,000 to their son's wedding. That evening, my mother called me at the apartment, saying she needed to talk about her dress, the mother of the bride dress she'd chosen herself 4 months earlier after rejecting 3 options I'd selected and shown her, and when I asked what was wrong, she said, "I just don't think the color is right. It washes me out. I look terrible in it. Why did you let me choose this dress?" And I'd reminded her as gently as I could that I'd actually suggested the navy dress she'd rejected, and she'd insisted on the champagne color. But she'd just sighed heavily and said, "Well, it's too late now. I'll just have to look washed out in all the photos, I suppose." Friday afternoon. The day before the wedding, my father appeared at the venue where David was overseeing the setup of the ceremony chairs and pulled him aside, and David told me later that my father had put a hand on his shoulder with this serious expression and said, "Son, I want you to know you can still back out if you're having any doubts. Marriage is a big commitment, and Sarah can be difficult. She's very demanding and she has very specific ideas about how things should be, so if you're not absolutely sure about this, now's the time to speak up." And David had looked my father in the eye and said, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, and Sarah isn't difficult. She just knows what she wants and isn't afraid to ask for it, which is one of the 1,000 reasons I love her." The rehearsal dinner that night at Avec was supposed to be an intimate, joyful gathering of our closest family and friends. But Jake showed up 20 minutes late, stumbling slightly and smelling unmistakably of whiskey, his eyes glassy and his words just a bit too loud. And when Rachel, my maid of honor and best friend since Northwestern, asked me quietly if he was drunk, I'd nodded and watched as my parents smiled indulgently, and my mother actually laughed and said, "Oh, Jake's just excited and celebrating a little early. He's fine." As if showing up intoxicated to your sister's rehearsal dinner was charming rather than disrespectful, and I'd seen Rachel's face transform into an expression of pure fury that she was barely containing. And she'd leaned close to me and whispered, "I am documenting every single thing they do, Sarah. Every single thing. Because this is insane, and someone needs to be a witness to how they treat you." The morning of my wedding, I woke up at 6:30 in the bridal suite at the Waldorf Astoria, with Rachel already awake beside me. And she'd stayed with me the night before like we'd planned since we were teenagers, imagining our future weddings. And for the first 2 hours, it was exactly what I'd dreamed about. Mimosas and laughter, and my bridesmaids arriving with bagels and fruit, and the makeup artist setting up her station, everyone taking photos and being silly and celebratory. And I remember thinking that maybe today would be perfect despite everything, that maybe my parents would rise to the occasion and be the parents I'd always needed them to be. My mother was supposed to arrive at 9 o'clock so she could get ready with us, and when 9:15 came and went with no word from her, I felt that familiar sinking sensation in my stomach that I'd learned to recognize as the prelude to disappointment. And at 9:30, she finally walked in without apology or explanation, immediately surveying the room with this critical expression that made my shoulders tense involuntarily. And her first words weren't congratulations, or you look beautiful, or I'm so happy for you, but rather, Sarah, is your hair going to be that high? It seems very dramatic. You don't want to look like you're trying too hard. Gesturing at the elegant updo my hairstylist had just finished. Soft and romantic with small white flowers tucked into the curls. Rachel's hand found mine and squeezed, and I watched my mother circle me slowly while the room had gone noticeably quieter, the easy joy from moments before dissipating like smoke, and she reached out to touch my face and said, "You're wearing a lot of makeup, honey. Are you sure you need that much? You don't want to look painted in the photos." Even though my makeup artist had created exactly the natural glowing look I'd requested, and when I said gently that I was happy with how everything looked, my mother had sighed and said, "Well, I suppose it's your day. You can do what you want," managing to make my autonomy sound like a character flaw. I was standing in my robe about to step into my dress when my mother said suddenly, as if the thought had just occurred to her, though I could tell by her tone it hadn't. "Remember when you were dating Michael Chen, your senior year at Northwestern? He was such a nice boy, so ambitious. And didn't he end up going to Yale for law school? I wonder what happened to him. I always thought you two were such a good match." And the comment landed exactly as she'd intended it to. The implication that I'd let a better option slip away, that David was somehow second choice or settling, and I felt something crack inside my chest because what kind of mother says something like that on her daughter's wedding morning? Ellen, David's mother, had been sitting quietly in the corner letting me have time with my own mother. But she stood up then and crossed the room and put her arm around my shoulders and said warmly, "Sarah, you look absolutely radiant. And in about 3 hours, you're going to marry the love of your life who worships the ground you walk on. And that dress is going to make everyone in that ceremony cry when they see you. You're going to be the most beautiful bride." And she turned to my mother with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "Don't you think so?" In a tone that was pleasant, but somehow also protective. And my mother had pressed her lips together and nodded and said, "Of course Sarah always looks nice." And I'd felt this moment of profound clarity wash over me, that today wasn't about earning my mother's approval or finally getting the validation I'd spent 28 years craving, but about choosing the family I was creating with David, about walking toward people who actually loved me rather than backward toward people who never would. The ceremony itself was beautiful in a way that almost hurt, the kind of beauty that exists despite everything trying to diminish it, and I walked down the aisle of the Chicago Botanic Gardens' intimate outdoor pavilion at exactly 2 o'clock on that perfect June afternoon, with my father's arm rigid under my hand, his face composed in what someone who didn't know him might mistake for dignified emotion, but what I recognized as uncomfortable obligation. And he didn't look at me once during that long walk, didn't lean close to whisper that I looked beautiful, or that he loved me, or any of the things fathers are supposed to say in that moment. Just stared straight ahead at David waiting at the altar and deposited me there like a package he was relieved to deliver. I saw David's face when he first saw me in my dress and watched his eyes fill with tears immediately, watched him mouth, "Oh my God," and press his hand to his chest. And that was the moment I understood what it meant to be truly seen by another person. And when we stood facing each other and spoke the personal vows we'd written, mine about finding home in him after feeling homeless my whole life, and his about spending the rest of his days making sure I never doubted my worth again, I heard sniffling throughout the crowd and glanced quickly at the front rows where David's parents were crying openly, Ellen dabbing at her eyes with a tissue and Robert's arm around her shoulders, and beside them my parents sat perfectly still, with pleasant, polite expressions that didn't change at all, like they were watching a mildly interesting television program rather than their daughter pledging her life to someone. The ceremony lasted 28 minutes, and when the officiant pronounced us married and David kissed me, the guests erupted in applause, and I felt this soaring sensation of joy that I tried to hold on to. And during the cocktail hour, while we took photos in the garden, I noticed my parents were nowhere to be found among the guests mingling on the terrace. And Rachel came and told me quietly that she'd seen them outside the venue entrance talking to my Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob, gesturing animatedly. And when I asked what they were saying, she hesitated and then said, "Sarah, it's your wedding day. You don't need to know right now." But I pressed, and she finally admitted she'd heard my mother saying something about all this extravagance and they're spending money like water. The reception began at 6 o'clock in the garden's elegant indoor pavilion with its floor-to-ceiling windows and chandeliers, and during dinner my parents sat at their assigned table barely touching their food, and when it came time for the father-daughter dance, my father had stood and offered his hand with the same enthusiasm someone might show for a dental appointment, and we'd moved mechanically around the floor to "Unforgettable," while he looked over my shoulder at something in the distance and said nothing at all. Not that I looked nice. Not that he was happy for me. Not even small talk about the weather or the venue. Just silence and the feeling of his hand barely touching my back as if he couldn't wait for the song to end. And when it finally did and people clapped, he'd nodded once and walked away without hugging me. And I'd stood there alone on the dance floor for just a moment before David appeared and pulled me close and whispered, "I've got you, always." And I'd let myself sink into him and tried not to think about the fact that my own father couldn't manage even the pretense of affection on my wedding day. By 8:30 in the evening, the reception had hit that perfect moment when the formalities were done and everyone had relaxed into genuine celebration. The dance floor was crowded with guests moving to September by Earth, Wind, and Fire, and I was dancing with David and Rachel and some of my college friends, laughing so hard my face hurt, feeling for the first time all day like maybe I could actually enjoy my own wedding despite everything, and I'd almost forgotten about my parents sitting at their table on the edge of the room, looking vaguely disapproving of all the joy happening around them, when I heard the sharp, distinct sound of someone tapping a glass with a fork. That universal signal that someone wants to make a speech or a toast. And the DJ noticed too and lowered the music gradually, and people began drifting back toward their tables or turning toward the sound. And I saw my mother standing at her table with a champagne glass raised and a smile on her face that looked pleasant and appropriate if you didn't know her well enough to see the particular set of her jaw, and my first thought was relief. That finally she was going to do the traditional mother of the bride toast, that maybe she'd say something kind, or at least appropriately generic about wishing us well, and I turned toward her with my own smile, the one I'd perfected over 28 years of trying to earn her approval, expectant and hopeful despite everything that had happened that day. And David's hand found the small of my back, and I felt him standing close beside me, and my mother said in her clear, carrying voice, "Everyone, I'm sorry to interrupt the dancing, but I have something to share with all of you." And she paused for effect, while the room settled into complete attention, and I saw David's parents at their table, turning to look with polite, interested expressions, and my mother continued, "As many of you know, when Sarah and David got engaged, David's wonderful parents gave them a very generous gift, a beautiful car, a Mercedes worth about $28,000. And she said it like she was praising them, but something in her tone made my stomach clench with sudden anxiety, and she went on. "Well, after much thought, we've decided that we're going to pass that car along to Jake, Sarah's brother, because he really needs it much more than Sarah and David do, since he's just starting his job search and could use the reliable transportation. And Sarah and David both have very good salaries, so they can easily get another car if they need one. And we think this just makes the most sense for the whole family." And she was still smiling like she'd announced something perfectly reasonable, something generous even, and for approximately 3 seconds the room was absolutely silent. That particular quality of silence that happens when people are trying to process whether they actually heard what they think they heard, and I felt my own smile frozen on my face like it had been painted there, felt David's hand on my back go rigid, felt something inside my chest that might have been my heart or might have been the last fragile thread of hope I'd been holding on to for my parents simply stop. And I saw David's mother's face go from polite attention to absolute horror, saw her mouth actually fall open, and saw David's father's expression transform into something I'd never seen before. a kind of cold fury, and my mother was looking at me expectantly, like she was waiting for me to thank her, or agree with her, or at minimum acknowledge the wisdom of her decision. And I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except stand there while 200 people stared at me and my mother and tried to understand what had just happened at what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The first emotion that hit me was pure physical shock, the kind that makes your body react before your brain can catch up, and I felt my face go hot and then cold and then hot again, felt the smile that had been genuine just seconds ago harden into something grotesque and immobile. And somewhere in the rational part of my mind, I was aware that 200 people were watching me, that this moment was happening in front of everyone I cared about, every friend from college and work, every family member, David's entire extended family who had welcomed me so warmly, and the humiliation of it crashed over me in waves so intense I thought I might actually be sick right there on the dance floor. But underneath the shock and the humiliation was something else. Something that had been building for 28 years and was now rising up through my chest like molten metal. A rage so pure and so justified that it actually steadied me. And I felt David move before I saw him, felt him step forward and put his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and supportive. And his voice when he spoke was controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath it like steel. "That car was a gift to Sarah and me," he said clearly, projecting so the whole room could hear. And then David's father was standing too, his face no longer showing polite interest, but something harder and more definitive. And he said in the kind of voice that people who've spent decades in boardrooms learn to use, "That gift was given to our daughter and our son-in-law, and it's not yours to give to anyone." And I saw my mother's smile falter for just a second before she recovered and waved her hand dismissively, like she was brushing away an irrelevant objection. "Oh, Robert, don't be so dramatic about it," my mother said with a little laugh that sounded practiced and condescending. "Sarah won't even miss it. They both make plenty of money and Jake really does need it more right now, it's just practical." And she said the word practical like it was a virtue, like her complete disregard for boundaries and basic human decency was somehow admirable efficiency, and I felt something crack inside me, not break entirely, but develop a fissure that I knew would spread. And I found my voice finally, heard myself say, "Mom, can we talk about this privately, please?" And even as I said it, I hated how small I sounded, how I was still trying to protect her from embarrassment, even as she'd just humiliated me in front of everyone. And my mother looked at me with that expression I knew so well, the one that said I was being inconvenient and tiresome, and she said, "Oh, Sarah, we can talk about this later. Let's not ruin your wedding by making a scene." And the irony of that statement, the absolutely breathtaking irony of her telling me not to make a scene after what she'd just done, hit me with such force that I actually laughed. A short, sharp sound that didn't contain any humor at all, and I saw Rachel moving toward the DJ booth, saw her whisper something to him urgently, and suddenly, Signed, Sealed, Delivered was playing again, the music swelling up to fill the terrible silence, and Rachel was grabbing the microphone and saying something bright and encouraging about getting back to dancing, trying to salvage the moment, trying to give me an escape route from this nightmare. But I was still standing there frozen with David's arm around me, and his parents standing like sentries, and my mother looking at me expectantly, like I was supposed to thank her, and I realized with sudden perfect clarity that this was it. This was the moment where I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be, and what kind of treatment I was going to accept for the rest of my life. I touched David's arm and leaned close to him, had to pull him down slightly because even in heels he was taller than me, and I whispered, "I need to talk to you and your parents and Rachel right now, somewhere private." And I heard how my voice was shaking, felt how my whole body was trembling with adrenaline and rage, and something that felt like it might be the beginning of freedom. And David nodded immediately and turned to his parents who were still standing there, looking between me and my mother with expressions of barely contained fury. And within 30 seconds the five of us were moving through the crowd toward one of the small private rooms off the main ballroom, one of those spaces the venue kept for brides to touch up makeup or have a moment of peace. And I was aware of people watching us go, of the music still playing thanks to Rachel's quick thinking, of my mother calling after me. "Sarah, honestly, you're being ridiculous." But I didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her, just kept walking until we were in that small, quiet room with the door closed behind us. And suddenly, I couldn't hold it together anymore. And I felt my face crumple, and the tears I'd been holding back all day, all week, maybe all my life finally broke free. And I was sobbing, not delicate crying, but the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and primitive. And David's arms were around me immediately, and his mother was there too, her hand on my back, and I heard myself saying through the sobs, "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep trying to earn their love. I can't keep accepting this treatment. This is my wedding day, and she just, and I couldn't even finish the sentence because the enormity of what my mother had done was hitting me in waves. And David's mother said quietly, "We know, sweetheart. We know. We've been watching how they treat you, and it's not right. Robert and I have talked about it several times, about whether we should say something." And I pulled back from David's shoulder to look at her. This woman who had shown me more maternal warmth in the 10 months I'd known her than my own mother had in 28 years, and she had tears in her eyes too. And David's father said, "Your parents' behavior tonight was unconscionable, but Sarah, you need to know it's been unconscionable for a long time. The things we've witnessed, the way they dismiss your accomplishments and prioritize your brothers. It's been painful to watch." And Rachel was standing by the door and she said fiercely, "I've been telling you for years that they treat you like garbage. I've watched them do it since freshman year of college, and tonight was the absolute last straw. You need to cut them off completely." And I wiped my eyes, felt my breathing start to slow, felt something crystallizing inside me, a decision forming that I knew would change everything, and I said, "I'm going to confront them, right now, in front of everyone. I'm going to tell them exactly what they've done, and I'm going to be done with them. I'm not doing this anymore." And I expected someone to tell me to wait, to calm down, to handle it privately. But David said immediately, "Whatever you need to do, I support you completely. We all do." And his mother nodded and said, "You deserve so much better than how they've treated you, and if you want to tell them that publicly after what your mother just did publicly, that's your right." And I looked at Rachel and she was smiling, actually smiling, and she said, "It's about damn time. Let's go." And I took a deep breath, wiped my face one more time, looked at myself in the mirror on the wall, and saw someone I barely recognized, someone who looked fierce and determined and done with being diminished. And I nodded and said, "Okay, let's do this." And we walked back out into the reception where the music was still playing and people were making valiant attempts to pretend everything was normal. And I walked straight to the DJ booth and said, "I need the microphone, and I need you to cut the music completely." And he looked uncertain, but something in my face must have convinced him because he handed it over, and the music died away, and 200 people turned to look at me standing there in my wedding dress holding a microphone, and probably looking like I'd been crying because I had been. And I saw my mother at her table looking annoyed, and my father looking uncomfortable, and Jake looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor, and I felt David come stand beside me, felt his hand find mine and squeeze it once, and I raised the microphone and began to speak. My voice when I started speaking was calmer than I expected, steadier than I felt, and I said, "First, I want to thank everyone for being here today to celebrate what's supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life." And I paused and looked around the room at all these faces, friends from college and work, David's relatives who had welcomed me so warmly, my own extended family who were looking confused and concerned. And I said, "I need to address what my mother just announced, because I think it's important that everyone here understands what just happened." And I saw my mother start to stand up, but my father put his hand on her arm and she stayed seated, and I continued. "About 10 months ago, when David and I got engaged, his parents gave us a very generous gift, a car valued at $28,000, and they gave it to us as a symbol of their support for our marriage and their welcome of me into their family. And my voice cracked slightly on that last part, because the contrast between David's parents and my own was suddenly so stark it was painful, and I took a breath and went on. My mother just announced, in front of all of you, that she and my father are taking that gift that was given to David and me and giving it to my brother Jake instead, because according to her, he needs it more and we won't miss it. And I heard murmuring in the crowd, saw people exchanging glances, and I said, "But this isn't really about a car. This is about a pattern of treatment that has defined my entire relationship with my parents, and I'm done pretending it's normal or acceptable." And now my mother did stand up and she said, "Sarah, that is enough. Sit down right now." But I didn't sit down. I just looked at her and said, "No, Mom, I'm not going to sit down. I'm going to tell the truth for once." And I turned back to the crowd and said, "When I was 17, I graduated as valedictorian of my high school class with a full academic scholarship to Northwestern University, worth over $200,000, and my parents took me to Applebee's to celebrate." And I let that sink in for a moment before continuing. When my brother Jake barely graduated high school with a 2.6 GPA and got accepted to community college, my parents threw him a party for 60 people at a country club and bought him a laptop and gave him a trip to Florida. And I saw my Aunt Susan nodding, remembering, and I went on. 3 years ago, my parents borrowed $3,000 from me because they said they were having trouble with property taxes, and they promised to pay me back within 6 months, and they never did, not $1. But 8 months after I loaned them that money, they bought Jake a gaming computer system that cost $2,500. And my father's face was red now, and he was shaking his head. But I continued. Last April, I was promoted to Senior Director of Marketing at my company, the youngest person in the firm's history to reach that level, and when I told my parents at Sunday dinner, my father said, "That's nice, honey," and then spent 45 minutes talking about how Jake had gotten a part-time position stocking shelves at Target. And I heard someone in the crowd gasp, and I said, 2 months ago, my parents missed my final dress fitting, the one time I asked them to be there, because Jake had a recreational basketball game. And the words were coming faster now, 28 years of hurt pouring out, and I said, "This morning, the morning of my wedding, my mother showed up late to the bridal suite, and the first thing she said to me was not that I looked beautiful, not that she was happy for me, but that I should have tried harder to lose weight before the wedding." And I saw David's mother close her eyes and shake her head, and I looked directly at my parents and said, "And here's the thing that hurts the most. In 28 years, you have never once told me you're proud of me. Not once. Not ever. And I spent so many years trying to earn that from you. Trying to be good enough, accomplished enough, successful enough. And I finally understand that nothing I do will ever be enough. Because the problem isn't me, it's you." The room was so quiet, I could hear my own breathing through the microphone, and I knew this was the moment where I either finished what I'd started or backed down like I'd been doing my whole life. And I was done backing down, so I took a breath and said, "But what my parents don't know, what I haven't told them because they've never bothered to ask about my life or my career, is that 3 weeks ago I was promoted again to Vice President of Marketing at my firm, at 28 years old, making me the youngest VP in the company's 40-year history, with a salary of $180,000. And I heard gasps throughout the room and saw my mother's face go pale. And I continued. "And what they also don't know is that I was recently headhunted by one of the top marketing firms in Chicago, and I accepted their offer, and I start in 1 month with a salary of $250,000 plus equity in the company." And now people were murmuring, and I saw my father's mouth literally hanging open, and I said, "David and I have also been working with a financial advisor, and we've saved $95,000 for a down payment on a house, and we're closing on a beautiful home in Lincoln Park in 3 weeks." And I paused to let that sink in before saying, "So the truth is, we don't need the car that David's parents so generously gave us. We could buy our own car tomorrow if we wanted to. But that's not the point, and it never was. And my voice was getting stronger now, more certain, and I looked directly at my mother and said, "The point is, that car was never yours to give away. The point is that you think so little of me and my accomplishments that you assumed I wouldn't mind you taking something that was given to me as a symbol of love and acceptance. The point is that you have spent my entire life making me feel like I'm not good enough, and nothing I achieve will ever matter to you." And I saw tears on my mother's face now. But I couldn't stop. I had to finish this. And I said, "I have tried for 28 years to earn your love and your pride and your respect. I have accomplished more than you ever dreamed I would, and it has never been enough, and I'm done trying." And my voice broke slightly, but I pushed through and said, "So I'm telling you now, in front of everyone here who loves me and supports me and values me, that from this moment forward, we are done. You don't get to be part of my life anymore. You don't get to dismiss my accomplishments or criticize my choices or treat me like I'm less than my brother. You don't get access to me until you can demonstrate that you understand how you've treated me and that you're willing to change and to treat me with the basic respect and love that every child deserves from their parents." And I felt David's hand squeeze mine, and I said, "And to be absolutely clear, this isn't about the car. You can't have the car because it's not yours and it never was. But even if we gave you every car we'll ever own, it wouldn't fix what's broken here. Because what's broken is that you've never seen me, never valued me, never loved me the way parents should love their child, and I deserve better than that. I have always deserved better than that." The silence after I finished speaking lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. And then my mother shot to her feet and her face was twisted with rage and humiliation, and she screamed, "How dare you embarrass us like this in front of everyone, after everything we've done for you, after we raised you and sacrificed for you, this is how you repay us?" And her voice was shrill and breaking, and people were staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. And my father stood up too, and he was pointing at me, and his face was red, and he said, "We gave you everything. We put a roof over your head and food on the table and clothes on your back, and this is the thanks we get? You ungrateful, selfish girl." And I just stood there holding the microphone and looking at them, and I felt nothing, no guilt, no doubt, just a strange, calm clarity. And then something amazing happened. My Aunt Susan, my mother's own sister, stood up from her table and she started clapping, slow and deliberate, and she was looking right at me with tears streaming down her face. And then David's mother stood up and started clapping too, and then David's father, and then my best friend Emma was on her feet applauding. And then like a wave it spread through the room, friends from college and work, David's relatives, even some of my own extended family members were standing and clapping, and my mother looked around wildly like she couldn't believe what was happening, and she said, "You're all crazy. She's manipulating you. She's always been dramatic and manipulative." But nobody was listening to her anymore, and I saw Jake across the room, and he had his head in his hands, and he wasn't clapping, but he also wasn't defending our parents. He just looked ashamed and small. And then Emma appeared at my side with 2 security guards, the ones we'd hired for the reception, and she must have gone and gotten them during those few minutes when I'd pulled everyone aside to make my decision. And she said to the guards, "These two need to leave. They're disrupting the wedding." And she pointed at my parents. And my mother's mouth fell open and she said, "You can't throw us out. We're the bride's parents." And Emma said coldly, "You're trespassers who just tried to steal a car that doesn't belong to you and spent the last 5 minutes verbally abusing the bride, so, yeah, we absolutely can throw you out." And the security guards moved toward my parents and my father said, "Sarah, you tell them right now that we can stay. You stop this nonsense right now." And I looked at him and I said quietly into the microphone so everyone could hear, "Please escort them out and make sure they don't come back." And my mother made this horrible sound, half sob and half scream, and she said, "You're going to regret this. You're going to come crawling back to us and we won't be there." And I said, "I'm counting on it." And the security guards took them each by an elbow, not roughly but firmly, and started walking them toward the exit. And as they were being led away, my mother was crying, and my father was blustering and threatening legal action. And then they were gone, and the doors closed behind them, and the room erupted in conversation. And immediately people started approaching me, extended family members I hadn't spoken to in years, my Uncle Tom and my cousin Rebecca and others. And they were hugging me and apologizing and saying they'd seen how my parents treated me, but they didn't think it was their place to intervene, and they were sorry. And I appreciated their words, but part of me was angry too, because where had they been all those years? But mostly, I just felt exhausted and relieved and free. After the security guards escorted my parents out and the initial shock began to fade, something unexpected happened. The energy in the room shifted from tense and uncomfortable to something lighter, almost celebratory. And Emma grabbed the microphone from me and said, "All right, everyone, we've had enough drama for one wedding. Let's get back to celebrating Sarah and David." And she nodded at the DJ who started playing upbeat music, and suddenly people were hugging me and David and telling us how brave I was and how beautiful the ceremony had been. And the rest of the reception became this joyous, liberated thing, like everyone had been holding their breath and could finally exhale. And we danced and laughed, and I felt genuinely happy for the first time all day, maybe for the first time in years around my family. In the days and weeks that followed, I learned that my confrontation had ripple effects I hadn't anticipated. My Aunt Susan called me 3 days after the wedding and told me she'd had a conversation with my mother where she told her exactly what she thought of how they'd treated me, and she said she wouldn't be attending family events if my parents were going to continue their behavior, and my cousin Rebecca sent me a long email detailing her own experiences of watching them favor Jake and how guilty she felt for never saying anything, and she said she was done staying silent. 1 month after the wedding, David and I closed on our house, a beautiful 3-bedroom brick home in Lincoln Park, with a small garden and original hardwood floors and crown molding. And we spent our first night there on an air mattress surrounded by boxes, drinking champagne straight from the bottle and laughing about how we were homeowners now. And I didn't think about my parents once that night, which felt like its own kind of freedom. They tried to contact me, of course. In the first 2 weeks after the wedding, I received 17 emails from my mother and 12 phone calls from my father, all of which I ignored, and the emails ranged from angry accusations that I'd humiliated them to tearful pleas that we talk about this like adults. But I deleted every one without responding because I meant what I'd said. I was done until they could show real change. 3 weeks after the wedding, I got a text from Jake that just said, "Can we talk? I know I don't deserve it, but please." And I stared at that message for 2 days before responding. And eventually, I agreed to meet him for coffee at a neutral location, a Starbucks downtown, nowhere near anywhere either of us lived. And when I walked in, he was already there looking nervous and ashamed, and he stood up when he saw me and said, "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I've been a coward my whole life, and I let them treat you like that, and I benefited from it, and I'm so, so sorry." And he was crying, actual tears running down his face, and I sat down across from him and said, "Why now, Jake? Why are you sorry now, and not any of the 1,000 times before?" And he said, "Because I always knew it was wrong, but I told myself it wasn't my fault. I told myself I couldn't control how they treated you, but seeing you stand up there at your wedding and lay it all out, hearing you list all those specific things, I couldn't hide from it anymore. I couldn't pretend I didn't know." And we talked for 2 hours that day, and it didn't fix everything, but it was a start. And I told him that if he wanted a relationship with me, it had to be separate from our parents. He couldn't be their flying monkey or their spy, and he agreed. 6 months after the wedding, I was thriving in my new position at the marketing firm, leading a team of 12 people and working on campaigns for major national brands. And David had gotten a promotion of his own, and we were talking about starting to try for a baby in a year or so. And we'd created this chosen family around us of friends and David's parents and Emma, and a few of my extended family members who'd proven themselves supportive. And I was genuinely happy in a way I'd never been before, not constantly bracing for criticism or dismissal. Then, 7 months after the wedding, a letter arrived at our house, forwarded from my old apartment. and I recognized my mother's handwriting on the envelope, and I almost threw it away without opening it. But David said I should at least read it, so I did, and it was 4 pages long, and it started with, "Dear Sarah, your father and I have been doing a lot of thinking since the wedding." And it went on to say they were sorry I felt hurt by their actions, but they'd only ever wanted what was best for me, and they didn't understand why I was being so stubborn about this when family should forgive each other. And there was one paragraph where my mother admitted that maybe they'd been harder on me than on Jake, but it was only because they had higher expectations for me. And the letter ended with a request that we come to Sunday dinner and put this all behind us. And I read it twice and felt my jaw clenching tighter each time because it wasn't an apology, not really, it was justification wrapped in the language of reconciliation, and they still didn't get it. They still didn't understand what they'd done wrong. I sat down that night and wrote my own letter, and I was careful and deliberate with every word. And I said, "Mom and Dad, I received your letter and I appreciate that you took the time to write it, but what you sent me isn't an apology. It's an explanation of why you think your behavior was justified, and until you can genuinely understand how you've hurt me and take responsibility for it without qualification or justification, we don't have anything to talk about." And I listed my terms. I said if they wanted a relationship with me, they needed to attend family therapy with a licensed therapist for at least 6 months. They needed to demonstrate through their actions that they understood they'd treated me differently than Jake, and that it was wrong. They needed to make genuine amends, not just for the car incident, but for the pattern of behavior over my entire life. And I said, "I'm not asking you to grovel or to pretend Jake doesn't exist. I'm asking you to see me as your daughter who has value and worth and who deserves your respect and love, and if you can't do that, then we have nothing further to discuss." And I mailed that letter and I felt good about it, clear and certain. Now, a year after my wedding, I can look back on that day with complicated feelings because it was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and in some ways, it was the worst. Standing there in my wedding dress, being humiliated by my own mother in front of everyone I loved. But it was also the day I finally chose myself, the day I finally said enough, and that decision changed everything. It changed how I saw myself, and what I was willing to accept, and who I allowed into my life. And I've built something beautiful in the space where my parents' toxicity used to be. A life filled with people who value me and celebrate me and treat me with the respect I deserve. And I know my worth now in a way I never did before. I know that I don't need anyone's permission to be proud of myself, or to take up space, or to demand better treatment. And while part of me still hopes that someday my parents will do the work and we can have some kind of relationship, I'm at peace with the possibility that they won't. Because I've learned that I can't control other people's choices, I can only control my own, and I choose to surround myself with love and support and genuine respect. I choose the family I've built over the family I was born into. And when I think about that moment at my wedding when I stood up and spoke my truth, I feel proud. Because it was the moment everything changed, the moment I finally chose myself.